You've been returning to the same threshold for 3 weeks. Each time you approach it, something shifts, and you step back. Not from fear. The ground under the decision just keeps dissolving before you can stand on it. This morning, that loop closes. Since late February, Saturn and Neptune conjunct at 0 degrees Aries have been removing structural clarity exactly when new decisions needed ground. Mercury retrograde in Pisces ran a pullback pattern on top of that until March 20th. Both are behind you. This morning at 7:18 a.m. Eastern Time, the Sun reached exact conjunction with Neptune at 1 degree 52 minutes Aries, the first time in 164 years this conjunction has occurred in Aries. Sun-Neptune today doesn't deliver the answer, it stops the retreat. The loop that kept returning you to the same unanswered edge had a specific structure, and that structure closes with this conjunction. What makes this transit different from any standard Neptune contact is where it sits. The first degree of Aries. That's not Neptune at the end of a dissolving cycle. That's a completely different mode. In the next few minutes, you'll discover 3 things. First, why the Saturn-Neptune conjunction in February set up a decision loop, not general fog, but a specific pattern of return. Second, why Sun conjunct Neptune at 0 degrees Aries closes it structurally, not gradually. Third, what opens in the 3 days after today, and where this sequence lands on March 25th. What kept pulling you back had a mechanism. That mechanism closed at 7:18 a.m. Eastern Time this morning. The threshold you've been circling does not keep retreating after its own conditions end. Think about what the return actually felt like. Not the decision itself, the motion. You approach it fully, with clear thinking, with intention, and somewhere in the approach, before you can land on anything, the surface disappears. You're not confused. You haven't changed your mind. The ground just isn't there. So you step back, and then a few days later, you do it again. That's not how difficult decisions work. A hard decision stays hard. You can at least stand on the difficulty. This was different. This was the approach itself, failing, every time. That motion ran from late February until this morning. Not roughly, exactly. There's a start date, February 20th, when Saturn and Neptune met at 0 degrees Aries. There's an end date, today, 7:18 a.m. Eastern Time. You're watching this after that end date has already passed. The loop isn't running right now. What you're doing in the next few minutes is understanding what it was, and why, structurally, it had to close here rather than a week ago, or yesterday, or gradually over the coming days. That requires going back to late February and looking at exactly what was built there, and how 2 separate mechanisms work together to create something more specific than fog. 2 things were running simultaneously from late February. They weren't the same thing. They reinforced each other in a specific way, and that's what made the loop as consistent as it was. The first, Saturn and Neptune met at exact conjunction on February 20th at 0 degrees Aries. Start with the degree. 0 degrees Aries is the first point in the zodiac, the degree where new cycles begin, where identity takes its first form, where a decision about direction needs the most structural support. It's not a neutral position, it's the entry point. When you're standing at a threshold that involves a new version of something, a new direction, a new role, a new answer about who you are now, that decision is forming at 0 degrees Aries by nature. Saturn is structure. It's what holds a decision in place long enough to act on it, the scaffolding, the frame, the ground beneath the answer. Neptune dissolves form, not violently, quietly at the edges until what looked solid becomes permeable. When those 2 planets met exactly at the degree where new decisions need structural support most, the result wasn't confusion. It was the specific absence of ground under anything that was beginning. Not fog over everything, targeted removal of foundation at the exact entry point. That was the first mechanism. The second started 6 days later. Mercury went retrograde on February 26th in Pisces. Mercury governs how thinking becomes deciding. There's a specific moment in any decision where you move from turning something over to landing on it, where consideration becomes position. Mercury is what makes that landing possible. Pisces doesn't hold edges. It's the part of the zodiac where the line between what you know and what you only sense becomes porous. When Mercury moves retrograde through Pisces, it doesn't slow that landing down. It removes the line between "I've already decided" and "I still don't know." You can reach a conclusion and not be able to feel it as a conclusion. Every arrival dissolves back into question. That's the pullback pattern. Not hesitation, not ambivalence. A structural condition where the act of concluding kept resetting to the act of considering. Now, put both together. Saturn-Neptune at 0 degrees Aries removed the ground beneath any new decision. Mercury retrograde in Pisces reset every approach back to open question. One mechanism took the floor away. The other returned you to the threshold each time you found the edge of it. Neither alone would have produced 3 weeks of consistent return. Together, they created a loop with no natural exit because the exit required ground that wasn't there, and every near approach ended in reset. Mercury stationed direct on March 20th. That ended the pullback pattern. But the pullback ending is not the same as the ground returning. Mercury going direct removes the reset mechanism. It doesn't restore what Saturn-Neptune took from 0 degrees Aries. The loop stopped cycling yesterday. The ground itself closes today, with a different transit, at a different degree, operating by a different logic entirely. And to understand why that transit closes it structurally rather than gradually, you need to understand what Sun conjunct Neptune in the 1st degree of Aries actually does, which is not what most people expect from a Neptune contact. Most Neptune contacts dissolve. That's the established pattern. Neptune softens edges, spreads uncertainty, makes the definite feel provisional. When the Sun conjuncts Neptune, the usual result is a day where identity feels less fixed, where direction blurs, where what seemed clear becomes harder to hold. That's Neptune in Pisces. And for the last 14 years, that's where Neptune has been. Pisces is Neptune's home sign. In Pisces, Neptune operates at full strength in its native mode. Dissolution, permeability, the merging of edges. A Sun-Neptune conjunction in Pisces doesn't give you a contour, it removes one. Identity becomes porous. The boundary between what you know and what you only feel disappears entirely. Neptune moved into Aries on January 26th of this year. That's a different sign with a different logic. Aries is the 1st degree of selfhood, the part of the zodiac where identity doesn't dissolve, it initiates. It's where the I takes its first form, not a completed form, the first one, the impulse before the structure. When Neptune enters Aries, it doesn't stop being Neptune, but it encounters something different, not the end of a cycle, not the dissolving of what's been, the beginning of what hasn't yet taken shape. Neptune at 0 degrees Aries is Neptune at the entry point of a new 164-year cycle. The last time Neptune was here was 1862. Every person alive today is experiencing this for the first time. And this morning, the Sun caught Neptune there. Here is what that changes. In Pisces, Sun conjunct Neptune placed personal identity inside a dissolving field. The self became unclear. In 1 degree Aries, the geometry inverts. The Sun, which represents the core of personal identity, the central organizing principle of who you are right now, meets Neptune not inside dissolution, but at the first point of new form. Neptune doesn't expand the fog here. It meets the first impulse of the self and gives that impulse its first outline, not a complete picture. An outline. That's why this transit closes the loop structurally rather than gradually. The pullback pattern that ran since late February worked by dissolving the ground at the moment of approach. Every time you reached the threshold, the surface disappeared. What Sun conjunct Neptune at 1 degree Aries does is replace that action, not by force, by changing what happens at the moment of approach. Instead of ground dissolving when you step toward the decision, the approach now produces a first contour. Something that wasn't visible before begins to have an edge. The retreat stops not because you pushed through it. It stops because the mechanism that generated it, dissolving ground at the point of contact, has been structurally replaced by a different action at the same point. That happened at 7:18 a.m. Eastern Time this morning. But closing the loop and having an answer are not the same event, and understanding that distinction is what changes how you read the next 3 days. What closed this morning is the retreat, not the distance between you and the answer. Those are different things, and right now they can feel identical, because for 3 weeks, the retreat was the only thing that happened every time you approached. The approach failed so consistently that the failure became indistinguishable from the decision itself. It started to feel like the decision was telling you something, like the returning was the answer. It wasn't. The returning was the mechanism, and the mechanism is what closed. Here is the actual state you're in right now. You're standing at a threshold that no longer moves away when you approach it. That's new. That's a genuinely different position than where you were yesterday or 3 weeks ago. But standing at a threshold is not the same as knowing what's on the other side of it. The answer isn't here yet. What's here is the ground to stand on while it forms. This distinction matters for one practical reason. If you don't understand it, you'll misread the next 48 hours. You'll approach the decision, feel that the pullback isn't happening, and then expect the answer to arrive immediately because the obstruction is gone. When it doesn't, the absence of an answer can feel like a new form of stuck. It isn't. It's a different phase of the same sequence, and the sequence has 2 more specific points ahead. The first is March 23rd. Mercury is now direct and moving toward an exact conjunction with the North Node at 8 degrees 50 minutes Pisces. This is not the first time Mercury has been at that point. It passed through there on February 12th, while still in direct motion before the retrograde began. At that time, something surfaced. A signal, a pull, a thought that arrived with more weight than usual. You may remember it. At the time, it didn't have a clear form. It was directional without being definable. Mercury returns to that same point on the 23rd, now in direct motion after the entire retrograde cycle is completed. What arrived in February as a signal without language is now looking for words. Not a new idea, the same one, returning with the capacity to be named. The second point is March 25th. The Sun reaches exact conjunction with Saturn at 4 degrees 43 minutes Aries. This is the first Sun-Saturn conjunction in Aries in approximately 30 years. What that transit does in this sequence is specific. It doesn't open anything new. It fixes what is moved. Saturn in Aries is Saturn in its fall. It doesn't build slowly here, it makes decisive contact. Whatever has taken shape between today and the 25th, Saturn confirms or it doesn't. There is no middle result. What holds at that point holds with real structure behind it. What doesn't hold falls away on its own, without effort from you. The sequence runs: ground today, language on the 23rd, structure on the 25th. You are currently at the first point. The loop closed this morning. The threshold stopped retreating. The next thing that happens is not a decision, it's the decision finding the words to describe itself. And that's a different event, with its own date, its own mechanism, and its own signal to watch for. The 2 dates ahead don't operate the same way. Treating them as one event, things get clearer by the 25th, misses what each one actually does. They have different functions, and the order matters. March 23rd. Mercury conjunct North Node at 8 degrees 50 minutes Pisces. The North Node is a directional point, not a planet, a vector. It marks the direction of forward movement in a chart, the pull toward what comes next, rather than what's already been resolved. When Mercury meets it, thinking aligns with that direction. Not thinking in general, the specific thought that's been waiting for the right conditions to land. But here's what makes this particular Mercury North Node contact different from a standard transit. Mercury was already here once. On February 12th, before the retrograde began, Mercury passed through 8 degrees 50 minutes Pisces in direct motion. Something arrived at that time, a signal, a pull, a thought that felt more significant than its context explained. It was directional without being clear. It pointed somewhere without naming where. The retrograde pulled Mercury back through the entire Pisces sequence. Now Mercury returns to that same degree, in direct motion, on the other side of the full cycle. What arrived in February as an unnamed pull now has the conditions to become a sentence, not a final decision, a first articulation. The thing you've been sensing but couldn't quite say out loud finds language. Watch for that on the 23rd. Not a dramatic revelation. A quiet moment where something that's been present for weeks becomes speakable. Then, March 25th. Sun conjunct Saturn at 4 degrees 43 minutes, Aries. Saturn in Aries is Saturn in its fall, which means Saturn here doesn't operate through slow accumulation or patient construction. It makes direct, decisive contact. In this position, Saturn doesn't build structure gradually. It either confirms or it doesn't. When the Sun meets Saturn at this degree on the 25th, the first time this conjunction has occurred in Aries in approximately 30 years, it acts as a seal on whatever is formed between today and then. What this means in practical terms, you don't need to force a decision before the 25th. What's alive and real will survive that contact. What's being held in place by effort, by the weight of 3 weeks of suspended motion, by the pressure to resolve something simply because it's been unresolved, will fall away. Saturn in its fall doesn't reinforce what shouldn't hold, it releases it. The result on the 25th is not ambiguous. Whatever passes through that conjunction is something you can actually name, and something that will still be there the day after. Whatever dissolves does so cleanly, without drama, because it was only being held by the conditions that are now closing. This is the full shape of what the Hook described as the third thing you discover. Not just that something opens after today, but where it lands. Today gives ground. The 23rd gives language. The 25th gives form. 3 days. 3 distinct functions. And the place you're in right now, standing at a threshold that stopped retreating this morning, is the first of them. What remains is knowing how to read the window correctly so you don't miss the signals when they arrive. 3 orientations for the next 3 days, not actions, ways of reading what's happening so you don't mistake the signals for noise. The first, notice the moment the approach doesn't fail. You've spent 3 weeks building a reflex. Approach the threshold, feel the ground go, step back. That reflex doesn't disappear the moment the mechanism behind it closes. Your nervous system learned to expect the withdrawal. So the first time you move toward this decision today, or tonight, or tomorrow morning, part of you will still be bracing for the familiar retreat. Watch for the moment it doesn't come. Don't push past it, don't test it repeatedly to confirm it. Just register it once, clearly, the ground held. That moment is the actual confirmation that what closed this morning closed completely. Not the astrology telling you so, your own experience telling you so. The second, on the 23rd, pay attention to what finds language. Not to everything, to the specific thing connected to this decision that becomes speakable. It may arrive quietly. A thought that's been present for weeks suddenly has a sentence around it. Something you've been sensing but couldn't articulate lands in words. That's Mercury returning to the North Node, the same point where a signal arrived in February, now accessible to the part of you that can say it out loud. Don't force it before the 23rd. Don't try to pre-articulate what you think it should say. The value of that transit is that it produces the natural language, the version that arrives on its own rather than the version you construct under pressure. The third, don't treat March 25th as a deadline. That's the most common misread of a Saturn contact, that you need to have the answer ready before it arrives, as if Saturn will close a door. That's not what this conjunction does in this sequence. Saturn on the 25th is a seal, not a gate. It fixes what's real. Whatever is genuinely formed between today and then, whatever is ground under it, whatever found language on the 23rd, Saturn confirms it and gives it structure. Durable structure, the kind that's still there a month from now. What doesn't have real ground under it will fall away on its own at that point. Not through dramatic collapse, through quiet release. The effort of holding it will simply exceed the reason to hold it, and it will stop. You don't have to make the right decision before the 25th. You have to let the wrong one go. 3 weeks of loop trained you to hold everything in suspension because every movement ended in return. That training is now working against you. The window between today and the 25th doesn't reward holding. It rewards the small, real movement that you've been prevented from making since February. One approach that doesn't fail. One thought that finds its sentence. One thing that holds when Saturn arrives. That's the sequence. The loop that ran for 3 weeks is closed. Saturn-Neptune fog, Mercury retrograde pullback, the dissolving ground under every approach. It peaked and passed. Where you're standing now is not the same place you were yesterday. The answer isn't fully formed yet, but it's no longer withdrawing every time you move toward it. That specific motion, the return, has stopped. In 3 days, the Sun reaches Saturn at 4 degrees Aries. What stopped retreating today begins to take a concrete shape, not as a feeling, but as a direction with structure behind it. What was suspended for weeks is about to become something you can actually name. Subscribe and stay close. March 25th is part of the same sequence, and it doesn't take long.